Welcome to Matera, everybody. This is an old castle town right in the middle of the Basilicata region of Italy. This place is absolutely spectacular for photography. The old city itself was built in the 3rd century, so it has so much beautiful texture and character. There are dozens of beautiful vantage points to photograph this, but for this city in particular, I want to do something a little bit different. I want to give it a little bit more dimension. Because while it's beautiful to look at, it also looks very one-dimensional. It's almost like looking at a still life painting. So I'm going to look for a vantage point that gives us the opportunity to show depth in the city instead of just a standard overlook. This city is fascinating to explore, and it's very interesting that up until the 1980s, nobody really inhabited the old city. In fact, it was considered to be slums, or where the poor people lived. In the 1980s, when tourism started to revitalize this town, the government actually helped fund an initiative to bring people back to the city, and it's become a thriving base of tourism in this region of Italy. Through the revitalization of tourism, plus this area being protected under UNESCO, it's become a very nice place to visit. Travelers and photographers, everybody can enjoy something about this city. And if you're not just here to photograph it, it also has a really wonderful nightlife, great little shops and restaurants, and it's really becoming a great destination to visit in southern Italy. This is my first time visiting the city, and I'm really excited to finally have the opportunity to explore it. So let's find the perfect vantage point to capture this enormous amount of beauty. Having walked all over this beautiful city and scouted nearly every vantage point I can find, I'm confident to say that this is definitely one of my favorites, and here's why. Everywhere that we found so far in Matera has been beautiful, but it seemed one-dimensional. The city kind of just sits there on the background. But here we actually have a tower in the foreground, and we have the beautiful tower and church in the background, plus the old city. So what this does is it adds a little bit of dimension to the town by giving us a foreground element and a background element to work with. Because there is dimension to this scene, it's the perfect opportunity to show you guys how slight changes in parallax can dramatically influence your composition. This location is perfect for shooting because I have this nice solid stone ledge. So instead of using a full-size tripod, I'm actually going to use my TFA Ultra by Really Right Stuff. This is a super sturdy and super portable option. And believe it or not, in this situation, it's all that I need to be able to get the shot. Something else I want to do with this spot in particular is shoot 2 different formats. So I want to shoot one wide in landscape format, and I also want to shoot one in portrait mode. The reason being is as I get closer here to this side, I can actually compress the 2 towers together and create a very nice vertical composition. As I start to move this way, it's going to spread those towers out, and it's going to be better suited for a wide composition. So now, rather than just talking about it, let's take a look at how the composition changes when I move slightly from the left to the right. Now that the camera's set up, I'm actually going to be recording a little bit of video so I can walk you guys through how the parallax changes. This first position here is actually right behind where I was standing a few minutes ago, and I'm very close to the tower itself. Not only that, is I've positioned myself where the 2 towers are very close together. But if you take a look here at my camera view, you can see that I'm shooting a wide angle. And again, remember, this is 16:9 mode, so I'm losing a little bit off the top and the bottom, but it still works for demonstration purposes. Right off the bat, though, it's interesting, but what I don't like is the towers are very close together. Not only that, if you look past the tower in the foreground, I'm actually blocking part of the church. The old town itself is really important, but the church is kind of a staple, the compositional element that really holds the town together. So right now this isn't going to work. I'm just going to move a little bit to the left, and as I move to the left, I'm going to reframe this composition so that we can see the entire church. Here we are in position number 2. I have revealed the entire church and also a crane, unfortunately, but you guys know in Photoshop that's easy to take care of. Now, as I start to address this composition, I like the wide angle, and let's just go a little bit wider than that. And you can see that the tower is still very dominant in the foreground, and I can see the church in the background. So this composition kind of works for me. You can see I've left some padding on the right side of the frame. I'm pretty much using the rule of thirds here. So if I were to cut this image into third sections, that tower pretty much sits on the line of the right third of the image. Well, what I don't like though is the tower in church kind of sits in the center. What I really want to do with this scene, since it's a wide scene, is I want to spread these two towers out. That way I have a lot of the city in the background and I have a great depth in the foreground. Right now I feel like those are the two most interesting elements, the church in the background, this tower in the foreground, and they kind of sit right in the center of the image. I feel like if I spread those out a little bit more, it's going to change the composition in a very positive way. This is going to be really easy with this little tripod and this wall. All I have to do to change the composition is just move over to the left. So let's go ahead and do that right now. As you can probably see now, I've just come down a few steps on this stone ledge to position myself a little bit more to the left. And if we take a look through the frame here of the camera, you can see that it's spread the near tower away from the church in the background. I'm going to go ahead and take this frame, and what we're going to do here, I'm really liking the way this composition works, but I want to start out as wide as possible on this lens. And I'm going to set that up. Let's go ahead and lock it down. Well, this is as wide as my lens shoots. This lens specifically is 16 millimeter. Right off the bat, I think it's too wide. It's a little bit too much. And I know this frame is a little bit dark, but on the right side of the image, you see a pink building. Now, nothing screams ancient city like pink stucco. I'm kidding, of course. Probably want to crop that out. Not just because of the pink building though, but because by pulling out of this image and shooting it at 16 millimeter, we've taken the focus away from the two main elements of the scene. So this looks nice wide angle, but my personal preference here would be to zoom in a little bit. So let's go ahead and do that first. I'm going to leave the video rolling and I'm just going to start reframing this. And if the horizon is a little crooked, guys, my apologies because I don't have a level while the X-T2 is recording. So as I zoom in here, guys, you can see that I'm cropping the top of the tower, so I'm also going to have to angle this slightly up as well. I want to give enough lead space for the tower itself. Now, by angling this up, I'm also getting a little bit of linear distortion. That's not a problem. We can fix that in post-processing inside of Lightroom or Photoshop. We can change those vertical lines. So something like this looks pretty good to me. I can just go ahead and make sure, still using that rule of thirds for this tower, making sure that I don't crop the cross on the top and really focusing on the city. So this is starting to look much better to me. Now, something to point out here, I like this shot, but you guys might actually like it further up there. You may want to zoom in more and really compress it down. The other thing is I could spread this town out even more. I have 1, 2, 3, 4 more steps down where I can make this extreme parallax between these two subjects. My fear, though, is if I go too far, it's going to spread them out so they don't look like they're part of the same scene. So by keeping them relatively close together, not side by side, and then zooming in a little bit, it feels like they're part of the same feature or the same city. And I really like the way that looks. But just since we're here and we're talking about composition, let's go the extreme and move down even further and see if we like it better or if we actually like this one the best. All right, so I moved down even further. Obviously, I'm going to have to reframe this composition. I feel like over here, I'm too far away from this foreground tower. Not only that, is I'm kind of looking at the flat side of it. When I was over to the right, it had more dimension because I could see two sides of the tower itself. But from here, it looks very flat. So if I get too far away from the foreground element, the danger is the foreground element basically just blends in with the background. So you can't tell that there's deep parallax in the scene. So I was right to assess that the last position we were in, somewhere in the middle, was the best. You guys come here by yourselves and you want to shoot this, you may draw a different conclusion. This really is a beautiful scene. And if you want it to kind of blend into the same scene, there's nothing wrong with shooting it over here. In fact, that's your own creative control. Personally, I'm trying to show the parallax, show the depth, the foreground and the background, but still keep it into a cohesive single frame. Now that we've decided on this composition with this camera, we've decided that it's going to be somewhere in the middle of what we just shot. Let's try something different. Now, I have 2 cameras and a bunch of tripods. Let's try a vertical composition instead, and let's see how we can frame this shot in a different way. So here I am. Camera number 2 is set up. I just want to point out that I do not have an L plate right now, so I'm having to tilt the ball head to the side to get a vertical composition. I could try to do the same thing with this little tripod because these feet actually will ratchet. So I could get enough clearance for the camera, but I'd need to use an L-plate to keep it stable. An L-plate would allow me to just rotate it and keep the center of mass right above the tripod, where in this case, if I were to try to use this little guy like this, it's still possible, but you can see it's not exactly stable. Working in this location, I've already established that I really like having the foreground tower and the background tower, but from over here, it's impossible to frame both. If I were to zoom out here, let's go ahead and zoom out, and simply rotate this towards the other tower, which I'm going to do right now here, I can frame that tower, and even if I zoom in on it, while it's mildly interesting, it's never something that I'd shoot without the background of the town itself. So the only way that I can actually shoot this with the town is to move my position. Let's go ahead and move up, see if we can frame those two towers together. If we take a look through the frame I have right now, I've moved back to my original position and I've framed this vertical composition to capture the foreground tower and the church tower in the background. What's really cool about this is you see that crane back there way in the distance? Let's say I don't want to do any Photoshop. What I can actually do is just move a little bit to the right. And I've actually masked the crane out without having to do anything in Photoshop. So that little few inches that I've moved from the left to the right doesn't change the composition, but it does save me a little bit of post-processing later. Talking specifically about this composition, this, again, it's a little tighter because I'm shooting vertical video in 16:9. So when I'm shooting through the camera, I'm going to have a little bit more leeway on the left and right. This lens is maxed out at its widest at 16. I could put the wider angle on and go out a little bit more. What I can't do is push in any. So at 16, if I start to go in, you can see that I'm going to lose some of the detail on the lower right of the frame. So I think that this is a very solid vertical composition. Well, something interesting too, if I had to pick a personal preference, whether I like the vertical composition or the horizontal composition, I'd say 9 out of 10 times I definitely pick the horizontal composition. That's just the way that I like to shoot. But imagine if we wanted to publish this on a book or a magazine. Well, books and magazines are mostly going to be a vertical format. So if you had to frame this city in a vertical format for a publication, this would be the composition you wanted to choose from. So often what I like to do, if there's a beautiful option for a vertical composition, I'm always traveling with at least 2 cameras so I can very easily frame 2 different compositions. In this case, I have the one camera shooting the beautiful wide view and I have the other camera shooting the vertical composition. What's interesting is a lot of the times when we find these locations, we think that the spot is the spot, and we don't give a lot of consideration to how much things change when we just move around a little bit. And yes, when you walk up on this location and you look out over the city, it's stunning. So the natural thing to do is put the camera down and feel like you have the shot. But what I like to do is really experiment. How does the parallax change? How do things change if I move from the left to the right, if I frame something wide, if I frame something vertically, if I zoom in or I zoom out? Now, these subtle things can give you the ability to create a unique photo that's your own. And that's the cool thing about this style of photography. We can all come here and we all might settle on something different. That brings me to another point too. Just because I like this composition doesn't mean you need to come here and shoot it exactly the same as me. As long as you're not doing something silly like cropping the top of the church or cutting out something that's important, you can really have your own creative liberty to do whatever you want. If you want to shoot wide, if you want to zoom in, if you like the parallax of the tower, or you just want to focus on the town, that's completely up to you. My personal preference, though, is to always try to find something different, and in this case, I really like the fact that we were able to explore not only a horizontal or wide and vertical composition, but I was also able to show you guys how the parallax changes just from moving 10 to 15 feet left to right. This whole lesson has been done, as you can see, during the day. And so far, we haven't done any shots during the day because the magic starts to happen when the lights in the city come on. So right now, the sky looks pretty nice. I'm not sure if it's going to light up with color, the sun setting really far to the right, but I do know that this is going to come alive during the blue hour. That basically wraps up the instructional portion of this demonstration. The next step is to just come back and shoot it during the blue hour. Since we've worked in Blue Hour for many shots already, I'm gonna go ahead and run through that, and the next time I see you guys will be in post-processing, where we'll run through both images and figure out which one we like the best. Welcome back to the post-processing studio, everybody. Today we are going to be post-processing the old city of Matera. Now, this is a really interesting composition. There's a lot going on, and the weather was, let's just say, classically interesting. Let's take a look in Lightroom and I'll show you what I mean. So here I have what is the beginning of what looks like is going to be a great sunset. See those clouds? They look great. But as I get into the sunset, this usually happens. A classic example, those clouds start to dissipate. It's a nice color, and then it leads into a really beautiful but blank sky blue hour. So this tends to happen. Clouds, especially in this part of Italy, in the southern part of Italy, they'll kind of line up. You'll have a really nice sunset going on, and then they just kind of dissipate. So the reason I've actually brought all these in, this is a pretty extreme example from the sun actually hitting the old cathedral there, to post-sunset when the lights just come on, the very beginning of blue hour, to quite a late blue hour actually, where we start to get some of the ambient light on this tower. We're actually going to combine all of these together, and we're going to do it in a different way than we've done before, and that's going to be pretty cool. We're actually going to be able to get some of this sky back in the scene, but in a different way, so it complements the blue hour itself. The other thing I want to point out is here, inside of Lightroom, I decided to go with the horizontal shot, the landscape version, and quite a wide version as well. I thought that the city really opened up. I like the way that this path came in, and I like the way that the sprawl of buildings and these lights continued to tumble down to the left of the frame. Now the vertical shot is cool too, and if I was working for a magazine and they potentially needed a cover, I might send them a version of that just in case they'd want it, because it actually would crop almost the same composition from here to here. Now I'm really happy with this composition, and I want to go ahead and get started with the post-processing. So the first thing is, as we go down here, let's go ahead and set our custom noise reduction on these, and I'll just say 20, and I want to go ahead and sync that before we move on. So I'm just going to select all the other surrounding images, go to the develop settings, and sync settings. The only thing that I changed there was the noise reduction. We'll synchronize. Let's go ahead and look at this blue hour shot. Scroll down here. Now I just want to talk about some of these transformations that we could make. Now previously we've done a few different things in Lightroom, including using the guided transformation. But I want to point something out. Notice how this tower seems as though it's sort of slanted, so it's kind of leaning to the right. And notice how this one is almost vertical, but it's also kind of leaning. But then notice how these lines are pretty much parallel, linear, and straight. If you also look at the right side here, you'll notice that this line is straight, this line is straight. So why is that? How can some of this geometry be off while some of it is actually perfect? Well, this is an ancient city, so there's no telling whether or not this tower is actually straight. This is actually part of the new old city, if that makes sense. And this is a beautiful cathedral, but again, it is straight-ish. It's not actually perfect, and it staggers. So if I actually click auto will try to fix it, but you can see that it's kind of distorting it. Now it's kind of shooting off to the left a little bit. These are angled off a little bit, and this side is sort of cropped off. Even if I try to level it here, it's going to be close. Like, that's definitely a little bit better, but now this feels like it's rotated off this direction now. So what we're going to do is just go ahead and put this build together. We're going to blend all of the layers, and then I'm just going to take care of it with a little bit of skewing inside of Photoshop. Sometimes, and in this case, we actually have to skew or distort the perspective to make everything seem like it's straight, because it actually isn't. Let's get started with some basic corrections. Now I'm just going to expose this a little bit more. We're going to pull the highlights down just a little bit. Say half a stop in the highlights. Let's also pull the whites down a little bit, maybe about 25%. And I feel like it's still a little dark. Let's pull the blacks up just a little bit, just so that we can get those up and we know that we can edit those. So really simple adjustments for the base layer. Let me right click, export with previous to get this into Photoshop. Now let's head back over to Lightroom really quick and adjust this. Now, this is the underexposed version. This is actually just going to be for the highlights. So I'm actually going to do something that I call a 50-50. We're going to say -50 here. Shadows are going to go up 50. Whites, -50. And blacks, 50. So we'll just kind of flatten that out a little bit just so we can pick up these highlights. And actually for the whites themselves, we'll make that 25 instead. Looks a little extra flat. And maybe even the highlights, actually, now that I look at it, just a little bit. Export with previous again. I'll select all, we'll copy this, and we'll paste it right on top of this layer. So much more flat, but you can see those highlights popping back into existence. Let's go ahead and create a luminosity mask. In the channels, I'm going to command click the RGB layer, and I'm going to name this Highlights. I'll name it Highlights 1. I'll make sure that this is selected, intersect, and load a new one. So now we have Highlights 2. With that loaded as a selection, I'll go ahead and create the folder. We'll name that Highlights 2 as well. Bring this layer, and we're going to go ahead and name these two. This is Adjusted Underexposed. This one's going to be Adjusted Neutral Exposed. All right, I'll hold Option key, click the Create New Mask button, and now we are just going to brush these in a surgical way, because the highlights aren't that off. They're off a little bit, but they're not too bad. But in some of these areas, especially these areas where there's a lot of yellow or a lot of lack of detail or loss of detail, we're just going to go ahead and brush these in carefully where they're needed only. On the tower itself, I think the tower looks pretty good, but these lights are obnoxiously bright there underneath that crane. Same thing here, all the way around here, and then maybe a tiny little bit right here. That's starting to look pretty good. All right, let's just go ahead and address these. These highlights are extreme. Let's go ahead and paint in some extra amounts there. And then here's another extreme highlight as well. Everything else looks pretty good. Pretty even. Maybe want to bring down a little bit of the highlights on the church. Again, that tower up there looks good. Nice. Okay, so that'll just about do it for our highlights. You can see that now we get our highlights. That small little adjustment goes a long way. Let's go back to Lightroom, and now let's talk about this layer itself. First thing I want to do is match the exposure that I had before. So that's a quarter stop here, and you know what? We'll also bring the shadows up 25%. The other thing is, I want to use this for a couple different purposes. We're going to use it to lighten certain parts of the highlights, but we're also going to use it to mitigate some of the blue color. So we've been getting rid of the blue color cast a few different ways. We've been doing it with adjustment layers. We've been doing it with some lighten modes. And this is a really good example where you have something that's very cool. And you can see here, those same tones, if we actually go to this image, the tonality stays the same, but the color actually changes. So when we lighten or use a different blending mode, we can actually remove the blue and add the warmth back to the base of the town underneath the lighting itself. So that's really useful. So on that school of thought, let's actually crank this up a little bit too. Let's change this from as shot to about 9,000, so it's extra warm. And you can see if I go a little bit further past 9,000, it's a little bit too much, but 9,000 feels a little bit warmer than it was, and it feels like it's nowhere near that same blue color that we have in the blue hour. Now let's bring this one into Photoshop as well. We're going to have a lot of fun with this layer. First things first, let's go ahead and bring this in as well. Put this right on top here. And we'll call this Post Sunset. Now that I've brought this layer into Photoshop, let's talk about it a little bit before we move on to the next series of steps. I'm going to back this out a little bit so we can see the entire scene. Now right now it's very different from the scene underneath, but if I change this to the mode that we've been using a lot, lighten, you can see that it's actually helping out the bottom of the frame quite a bit. See how it mitigated all of those blues, and also see how it's brought the brightness of that tower up while also getting rid of the blue shadows. Now we don't want any of this in the sky, but we definitely want it to be in the tower itself. In fact, we're going to do a couple different things so that we can isolate a selection of the tower and use one of these layers to basically bump that contrast. So we're going to be using a combination of this layer and a few different modes to actually bump the overall luminosity of this tower itself. Now, truth be told, there are lights in these towers, but they're not functioning. So I actually saw these lights flickering on and off and almost turning on. I was actually there just recently, a few weeks ago, and they still haven't repaired the lights. So they have the cable running the lights, but they're not functioning. So as it got darker, you can also see that this tower got darker as well. We're going to have to add our own custom brightness there and repaint those values. But to begin with, this works really well. So we know that this is a lighten mode. So let's just go ahead and call it lighten. And I'm going to create a folder here first, and we're just going to call this post sunset. And I'm going to bring this in right here. So right off the bat, in order to get the bottom of the town, notice I don't like the color effect that it's happening here. So what we're going to do is add a mask with the gradient tool. And I'm going to go ahead and start from about here to here. So that's a good start. And again, I can go ahead and bring in the paintbrush, and we can brush in a little bit of this. Some of this area here, some of this on the tower, maybe some of this over here, and some of these other blues to help mitigate those. But I can't really go past here without making a selection, because you can see I'm going to affect the sky as well. So let's do something a little bit different. We're going to try a new selection method technique. Let me go ahead and duplicate this layer, Command J. I'm going to move it to the top of the composition and put it back to normal, and I'm going to delete this mask. We're going to delete it. What I want to do is get a nice selection of the town and the sky itself. Now we could do that by using the lasso tool, or a combination of the magic wand, or there's another way you can do it by going up here and saying select color range. Select color range works. Sometimes you can see that we can kind of grab a certain area and remove other portions of that area, but it doesn't actually work that great when you have surrounding color. It's based on color itself, not areas of contrast. So the magic wand tool would probably pick some of this up, but we'd still end up with little artifacting on the edges. So what we're going to do is we're going to use an option called select and mask. Now with any of these marquees selected, that option is going to come up right here, and it's also under the select and mask menu. First thing I want to do is turn off everything below, because when I select this and click select and mask, it's going to bring up a custom palette, and it's going to allow me to show the transparency of this object. Now when I turn everything off underneath it, it's just going to show me the checkered background, which is exactly what I want. So if I change this transparency to something like 5%, we have a couple options here. Now we have additive, and then we also have refine. So this is where we brush in our selection. And as I just click and paint this, you can see that it's going to brush in a selection of the sky. If I toggle the transparency now, you can see what's happening. This is what's called overlay mode. So right now I'm in overlay mode. If I take the transparency to, let's say, 100%, you can see that it's done an okay job around these edges. But I've missed a couple things. I've missed the crane, which is becoming a very iconic element of Matera since it's always under construction. I missed the cross up here in a couple of these towers. Well, what's nice is all of the same hotkeys work inside of this menu in Photoshop, your zoom, your pan, and everything. So with that in mind, and this set to 100% transparency, there are also some other useful hotkeys here. So right now, like I said, we're in overlay mode, and that's O on the keyboard. But if I hit K, it'll actually show black and white. If I hit M, it'll show me my whole image with crawling ants. If I hit the F key, that'll show me the rubylith or the quick mask mode, something that we're very used to looking at. But let's go back to overlay, and O on the keyboard for overlay, and let's select the refine brush. Now I want to add, so what I'm going to do is just paint over this area here, and you can see that it just adds that. It's looking for points of contrast. Let's say that we want the top of this tower here. You can see that it adds just that top of the tower. So you see the crane, if we wanted to add the crane, and in this case I do. That little tip of the building there, and we missed a little bit of the sky. So we can actually address that here shortly. And let's go ahead and just bring in these little areas, these light areas of contrast that would be pretty difficult to select just using the standard masking features. This goes based on an edge detection, and not just an edge detection, but an opacity detection. So a lot of this here, like that crane, those little wires, these telephone or satellite receivers, anything that's on top of these buildings here, those have light areas that are actually opaque and a lot of edges that are actually anti-alias. So this actually goes through and sort of fixes that. Now let's actually switch the mode. I hit K and we can see what we're actually getting here. Now it's starting to look pretty good. If I hit M, you can see that I get the crawling ants. Now this is what I like to do. Once I get into this really super selection area, you can actually grab the lasso tool and manually remove little bits. So rather than having to manually do this from scratch, we can start with one of these selections and then we can just kind of clean it up as we go. So what I'm doing is just cleaning up small edges with the lasso, and then you can see inside of here we did miss a little portion of that, which is not a big deal. So let's just go ahead and refine it by hand. That looks pretty good. Everything here looks pretty good. Same thing here. We may have to brush that a little bit, but we can go ahead and refine that edge here too and just clean it up manually. Again, this is something that we will also address manually as well. So let's just go ahead and do this. Small cleanup. A lot of the time, getting the broad strokes done with one of these methods is much better than doing this from the beginning by scratch. I'd rather just clean up 10% than have to create 100% of a new mask. That looks pretty good. Let's go back to black and white, and again that's K. Now you can see that the edges don't look great. There's some softening, they're not bad, but what we can actually do is smooth it out. Not using smooth. I'm not a huge fan of the smooth slider. Doesn't tend to help much, but we can actually change the contrast. And as I zoom in on this, I want to show you guys what that contrast does. It takes into consideration the edge and allows you to kind of clean up some of the, what I call collateral damage. So these little areas here in the contrast, it'll actually allow you to sort of pump those out, just like that. So we can take this up anywhere between 40 to 50. After 50, it may start to get, well, a little bit crunchy on the edges. We want it to be sharp, but we also want it to be clean and smooth. So if we go back to the overlay mode, we can see what this looks like. We can actually take the transparency down a little bit, and you can toggle this until you feel you've got something that looks pretty good. Now something to point out, let's not shift the edge. That's sort of a global command. We can always do something like that later. So with this, our basic selection, now we just have to say, how do we want to output this? Do we want a layer mask? Do we want a new layer with mask? We'll even do a new document. So I'm going to actually just say selection. And when I say OK here, it loads it as a selection. I'm going to immediately go to the channels, and I'm going to create a new channel for this. We're going to name this Sky Base Selection. And that's just going to save it in the palette just in case I mess it up later. So first things first, let's go ahead and leave it selected. It's still selected. I'm going to go back to layers here, and on the post sunset layer, first thing I'm going to do is take this selection with Command-Shift-I, invert this selection, and we're going to go ahead and apply it to that post sunset folder. And let's go ahead and move this back in. Now we'll start with turning all of the layers on, and we'll turn this one off for now. So now you can see this one exists inside of here. So what I can actually do now, since this is selected, I can actually go ahead and paint inside of this selection. Now notice something wrong right off the bat here. Yep, you guessed it. I'm going to have to zoom in here, and this one's really close on those edges, but what I'm going to go ahead and do is manually lasso out this little bit right here. So we'll go ahead and select that. This one's not so bad. I actually forgot to do this one. Could have done that in the Refine Edge tool as well. So there we go. Let's go ahead and knock that one out. So we're just going to go ahead and black that out as well. Not a problem. Pretty easy stuff. So let's go ahead and get rid of the Rubylith mode. Let me just go ahead and go back to the paintbrush mode. And I'll go ahead and do that like this with a flow of about 20. And I'll go ahead and paint in this tower and this area. That looks pretty good so far. But let's take it a step further. After I paint this in, I want this tower to pop. I feel like it's way too dark on the top portion. So what I'm going to do is take a new layer here, the same layer actually, the post sunset adjusted lighten. I'm going to turn this on again, set it to lighten mode, and you can see it's going to do nothing on top of there except for bring in those extra areas. This time what I'm going to do is also create a curves layer. I'm going to link this curves layer to specifically this layer, and we're going to adjust the curves. Now that it's linked, when I make changes, you can see that it's actually going to change the overall luminosity of the underlying image, which is actually pretty cool. So it's taken that light and blending mode and it's actually creating more luminosity. So where this area was dark, I was worried about that while we were on the scene, I knew that we'd be able to adjust it in post-processing without too much of an issue. So here I can go ahead and make that custom sort of gamma boost, and it's only going to be applied here. Next thing, I can mask this out, and you know what? Let's say we only want it on the right side of the image. So I'll go back to the gradient tool, and I'll draw it from here to about here. That looks pretty good. And actually, I can go ahead and scale this a little bit too, just so I get it right. The whole tower in there. That looks good. Next thing, let's go ahead and toggle it on and off. Let's paint some of this out. Now, remember, that selection wasn't perfect, but that's okay. So see these little areas up there? I want to be careful because those were those little areas. So I can either clean that up, or the easier thing to do is to actually go in and brush some of that out. So I can just brush those edges away, and brush those edges away here. Very, very easy. Same thing here. It'd be easy to go in and either clean up this mask or just go ahead and brush out some of those edges that are looking like hard edges there. Not that difficult to do. In fact, with this one right here, we may want to just go in and quickly make that selection, which is just as simple as drawing a little bit and filling it with black. No problem at all. Same thing here though, I'm just going to go ahead and remove some of these homes here. They don't need to have that color. It's not a problem at all. Just like that. Easy. It even picked up the cross on the top. So let's zoom out a little bit. Now that I have this selected, we can go into the curves and make those adjustments until we feel like the luminosity of this side of the image matches how it should be in the composition. The way it was originally, I don't think it really stands out, but bringing it up like this definitely makes it stand out more and punches it from that background. So that looks pretty good. Let's head back into Lightroom. Perfect. Let's take a look at this shot here. Well, first of all, I don't think we could use this sky. This is basically a daytime sky, and it's not even a sunset sky. I don't think we could believably compose irregular clouds into a late blue hour shot and have it look fathomable. I mean, if the sky was going off, if this was red, we had some more details over here maybe. Well, let's try something different. So let's go ahead and just pull the highlights down just a little bit. We can bring that back down to something that's going to be a little bit more usable. And I'm also going to bump the contrast of this. Let's go ahead and bring that up as well. Something just like that. And you know what? We'll make it an even 30, and we'll take this, and let's bring this in, and let's try a few things in Photoshop. So I'm going to export that as well with previous. We'll bring this in with our hotkeys, copy, we'll close that, and we'll paste this right on top of everything. And we'll call this Daytime Sky. So obviously, huge difference from here to here. We can't do anything like lighten. You can see, well, we're going to need that selection, but even if we did something like this, it's not really going to work. And if we had normal, and let's just say for a test, we did something, and this is going to have edge problems like this, you can see that this sky, it's nowhere near the same tonality and the same range of colors and light and exposure. It just wouldn't work. This is way too unbelievable. So previously when working on shots, we had the ability to take things, you know, from one extreme to the other, but this is such a dominant late blue hour scene that there's no way that's going to work. So let's experiment with some other blending modes. Let's try some different ones. Let's try multiply. Well, you know, now we are getting something. So multiply is not bad, but let's try something like overlay. That's not too bad, actually. Overlay looks pretty good. Now, some of these other ones, soft light, hard light looks very similar to overlay, but it's adding that sort of purple and lighter area in the sky. I just want this to be a simple blue hour. So we're going to change this to overlay. All right, so that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and create a folder, and we're going to call this Sky Replacement. And I'm just going to drag this mask up to Sky Replacement because that's actually where we need it, and we'll go ahead and bring this layer inside of that folder. That way we can have some independent masking. Now, what's interesting, when you have a completely blue sky, it's often the easiest time to bring in a new sky. Now, here's the thing though, this Sky Replacement layer that I created is pretty good, actually. It's pretty clean if we take a look at it. But it's not perfect. There are some issues around the edges. There are some things that we'd have to overcome. But all in all, you can see even around these edges here, around that cross, that's easy to clean up with a little bit of a brush. It works pretty well. But I'm always concerned about anti-aliased edges. So the problem is if I start painting some of this in, and I'm just going to show you if I paint this mask in white, you can see that I'm going to overlay the crap out of those buildings. So overlay is a very unforgiving blending mode in a lot of applications. So over this tower, it's going to basically take away all that luminosity that we worked so hard to preserve. So what I like to do with these kind of skies is actually minimize the areas on these selection borders, basically. So these areas that we've tried to maintain and create a selection needs to be 95% accurate. But even if it's 100% accurate, we're still going to have some edges. So here's what we can do. With this daytime sky, we can go ahead and create a gradient on this. And what I actually want to do is mask it out a little bit. We're going to use the gradient tool just to take it, let's say, fully opaque at the top, and then it's going to sort of fade out towards the bottom. So that looks pretty good. And I'm going to draw this until I get it right. Something like this. Now notice I'm drawing past the horizon. If I make this too abrupt, you can see it looks too abrupt. But when I start about mid-sky and move down to about mid-town, you can see that I'm just removing it ever so slightly on the town itself. And I can keep trying until I get this just right. And I want it to look fairly natural like it does there. So now we have some of it removed from the bottom of the area here. And what's nice is now those edges there are going to look less intense. Do you see how that works? We removed about 50% of the opacity. Now these edges aren't as crucial. You can actually get away with light masking instead of heavy masking. But let's take it a step further. Now that we have our basic mask set, let's do something else. Let's increase the contrast around the top of the sky. So I'm going to go ahead and create a curves layer. And we're going to link that to this layer just in case we bring anything else in. Now, as I start to change this, you can see I can make the sky brighter and I can make the sky darker. So what I actually want to do is add a little bit of contrast here in the sky. So I want to make it really contrasty, just like that. I think that looks pretty good, actually. And we'll turn this on and off. So we've added some contrast. Now I want that contrast to just fall on the very top of the sky, which is about here to here. And I'll just go ahead and draw that down a little bit more, like that. Whoops. Let's say like that. Perfect. So now I have heavy contrast on the top. Now what I'm going to do is create a new curves layer. And I'm going to link this as well to the layer underneath. Now this is going to do something a little bit different. This is going to remove contrast. So where we usually clamp values, what I'm actually going to do is raise this up and remove the contrast. So notice how that's removing the contrast in the sky. Keep this in mind. When you add a sky to a scene, sky replacement, and it looks different, it's a little bit more dramatic. Now we've already taken some of the opacity down on those edges, but sometimes that makes it look like a fade. If we also change the color tonality as if there was some light on the horizon causing those clouds to be a little bit brighter than before, then we can kind of fool the viewer into thinking that it's a natural progression of these clouds. So you can see that I can just simply remove some of that contrast, just like that. And that's removing the contrast. But of course, we don't want to remove the contrast on the whole thing. We just want it to be on the sky. So about here to here, we'll remove the contrast. Just like that. So we have contrast reduction on the bottom of the sky. So now our sky replacement looks like this. Pretty cool. But we actually take a look. I feel like it's a little too saturated. So let's go ahead and address that. Inside the sky replacement, already got a good thing going here, so let's go ahead and we're going to keep these curves. Let's go ahead and name these. We'll call this contrast boost and contrast reduction. That way when you guys open up this PSD, you'll see everything named perfectly. Let's create a new one, hue and saturation. Same thing, we'll just go ahead and link it in. Pretty easy. And we're going to say blues. And with the blues selected, might as well pull it into the cyan territory a little bit. And let's just take the lightness and we'll pull it down. So you can see now that's going to become a little less saturated and a little bit more realistic with the background. And we're just going to tweak that until we like the result. Somewhere between 50 and 60 will be fine. So we'll call this blue sky reduction. Next step, we'll go ahead and close this up, create a new layer. I'm just going to call this object removal. Now, obviously, there is a big glaring spot on that sky after we're happy with our composited sky here. Now it's time to clean it up. Let's go ahead and zap that guy out a little bit. No problem. There are some hot pixels and or stars. Actually, I'm going to go with hot pixels this time. We'll just go ahead and be very careful to identify any issues up here. Looks pretty good. Sky looks pretty good. Up to you guys if you want to remove the crane. It actually composited perfectly with the sky. You can see the clouds behind it. I'm going to leave it. That crane's been there as long as I've been visiting Matera, actually. I'm just going to leave it as part of the Matera culture. This wire, you know, again, this is one of those things where it's up to you guys. I'm actually going to use the clone stamp, and I'm just going to easily and quickly remove this. It'll only take a moment. Same thing, it's infinite texture, easy details, so we can just kind of just go ahead and make it up as we go along. Nothing down here is crucial. In other words, nothing here is detail that we're going to miss if something gets removed that shouldn't get removed. If this was part of a house, for example, or as we get closer to the tower, then it's a little bit more important. Even here, really easy, because this is just rocks. Something like this, super simple. We can just grab some of the pixels below, change the brush size a little bit, and just kind of line this right up with that edge, right about there. Easy, easy, not a problem at all. There's also some little things that may be distracting to you guys, and definitely to myself. You can find some of those colors to be distracting. Wires like this, don't worry about it. Also here, this says ECO. I'm going to leave it. It's, again, it's been there for a long time. I don't really know why it's there, but it is pretty cool. So we'll go ahead and keep it just like that. So very easy object removal on this one. Next step, we're going to take everything here, Command G, we're going to group it together. We're going to call this blended result. Perfect. I'm going to use Shift Option Command E to create a new layer. And we're going to go up here to filter. We're going to marry all this together by entering the camera raw filter. Let's bump the shadows a little bit, blacks a little bit, tiny little bit of contrast just to bring it back. And you know what? Let's have some fun with a little bit of dehaze. That looks pretty good. Nice. Let's also correct some of the luminosity here too. Now remember that difference between orange and yellows? A lot of yellows here, but these oranges to me look a little intense. We can actually change it here. Let's change that to about 20. And 20 is going to soften them up just a little bit. We could also do the same thing in the blues. And you can see just a little bit of brightness here, a tiny little bit makes a big difference. Changes the entire sky. So we'll go ahead and give that about 10. And you know what? Let's shift over to the hue. Well, something that is bothering me about this sky is not the blue. The blue actually looks pretty good. Believe it or not, it's the purple. And as I start to tweak that, you can see that there's quite a bit of purple in the sky. I can hue shift the purple, and as you can see, purple either goes to more purple into red, magenta, or we can actually shift it more towards the blue. And as I do that, you can see it cleans up that sky a little bit. Too much and it goes cyan, but just enough, and it actually mitigates that purple color that we had in this area. While we're on the subject of the sky, let's create a new layer to pop the intensity of this sky a little bit. Something from there to there. Let me go ahead and reset my local correction settings. First thing is saturation. I can pull the saturation down a little bit. Too much is too much, but just enough will actually give me a lighter saturation here. Obviously there's not a lot of yellows, but what I want to do is just go ahead and pull the saturation of that sky down. It's already very, very blue. Next thing I want to do breaks out of my traditional method of not using very much clarity, but honestly for intensity in the sky, a little bit of clarity goes a long way. And you can see as I start to bring that in, how it's going to bump that contrast in the sky. Now take it too far and it looks like a bad HDR, but if you go just a little bit, maybe about 20 here, we can do the same thing that a dehaze would do. But the thing about dehaze adds a lot of saturation as well. Clarity adds a little bit of artifacting, but it increases the contrast in the tonality, but it doesn't typically increase the saturation. But just like we can mitigate the dehaze effect, we can mitigate the clarity by bumping the shadows up a little bit as well. So we'll go ahead and bring the shadows up to about 20 to compensate. Let's go ahead and we'll go back and make sure there's nothing else that we want to change here. That actually looks pretty good to me. Our global adjustments, shadows look pretty good. All the levels look pretty good to me. Let's apply the result. We'll call this ACRF. Save it in the background and let's go ahead and mitigate the last bit of blue really quickly with a hue and saturation. Let's go to the blues. Now, this is not going to be too intense. If I zoom in on this image here, you can see there's some blue here and there's some blue here. So we have the blue selected. Let's go ahead and include some of the cyans. Let's go ahead and adjust the lightness. As you can see, we're getting an effect on the sky itself. That's okay. I'm really only looking at the buildings. Plus 45, plus 46 or 50. Any of that will be fine. Let's go ahead and do that. Let's black this mask out. And we'll just go ahead and brush in the result. So brush it in here. Brush in some of this blue reduction. And we got rid of most of it. Most of it was mitigated by that layer that we brought in from Lightroom, but there's still a little bit here and there, some of it that we missed. Now remember, I didn't lighten that layer over top of this part of the town because it made it a little bit too, well, it's kind of like a pink tone that I wasn't entirely happy with. So we can just go ahead and remove some of that blue. Very easy to do, 100% manually, just like that. Next thing we can do, since we already have the masks in place, let's go ahead and create a high pass filter for this. Filter, other, high pass. Now this is pretty cool because we know we have the town selected. So when I change this to overlay, and we kind of look at what it's doing to the town there, it's really adding some extreme sharpness, which I feel this town needs. And we might want to take that down to about 78 to 80%. That looks pretty good. Now, we already have these great masks. So I have the post-sunset mask here. Let's go ahead and select that and apply it to this. Now we have sharpening just inside of that area. But again, I don't want to sharpen these edges. So I can do a few different things. One of my favorite things to do is actually go into the mask. And what we're actually going to do is fade the intensity of this effect from top to bottom. But rather than putting it in a folder and having a nested mask, we can just go to the gradient tool. And we can do this quickly with multiply. So with the gradient selected, I can actually multiply from about here. Let's say we want the full extent of this to be here to about here. And you can see that that's softening that effect. And we can go over again one more time from there to there. Now that looks pretty good to me. So we have a softened mask. You can see that it actually now evenly sort of falls into that town and falls out. So we'll call this high pass filter. 2.5. Next thing we're going to do is duplicate this with a Command J. We're going to go back into Camera Raw Filter. Now we're going to have to do some aggressive noise reduction because I used clarity. And not just that, I use the overlay function. So if we actually zoom into this, you can see there is quite a bit of noise to take care of. Again, posting to Instagram, not a big deal, but when you want to print this, it may become a problem. So our noise reduction, let's go ahead and take a look at this. We have about 35 to 40, really brings that back. And our detail we can keep somewhere between 60 and 75. So that's a good noise reduction. We'll say OK on that. And now what I'm going to do is take the same sky replacement here, and we're going to go ahead and set that to camera raw filter, which is noise reduction. And let's really take a look at this here. Now the noise reduction is fairly strong, but let's see if it's doing anything to our edges. And it actually is doing a really nice job. You can see here along our edges, we have the noise. You can see all that noise just disappear. It looks pretty good. So the other thing that we can probably do here, just in case we have any edge discrepancies, with the noise reduction mask selected, go up here to the options, just properties, and we can change the feather of this as well. So we just want to feather that mask a little bit so it softens it up. That way it's not a hard edge, just in case there are any discrepancies. So that should soften that out quite a bit. Let's go ahead and change this. Here we have noise reduction, hue saturation. Let's name this blue reduction. And now let's shoot over to Lightroom really quick. Let me go ahead and reset our base exposure here. So I'm just going to go ahead and reset it. And I'm going to export this once again with previous. Use unique names. Select all. I'll paste this in, and we're going to put this right on the bottom. We're going to call this original raw. This scene is coming out great, but the next thing we need to do, and the last thing we're going to do here, is actually figure out how this is tilted and how to get over that. So what I'm actually going to do is select everything here and just group it together, and we're just going to name this complete image. And I'm going to do this manually. I'm not going to draw any lines or anything. I'm just going to hold Command and press T. So Command T, and I'm going to bring this up. So everything looks fine, but what I'm actually going to do is just tweak this just a little bit. And I'm going to hold Shift, and you can see that that's making that small adjustment. That's too much. So I'm going to Command Z that, and we're just going to tweak this just a little tiny bit. That looks pretty good. And now you can see how that feels a little bit more straight, and this feels a little bit more straight. Now, by distorting it, I've just distorted it a little bit. I haven't changed the vertical lines here. These all seem correct, and even this one still looks pretty good to me. So let me go ahead and apply that by hitting Enter. That looks pretty good. If I do a Command Z, you can see the before and the after. Slight change, slight skew, that's all it took to get it to be correct. Now let's go ahead and take a look at everything that we've done so far, and what I always like to do here is we're just going to zoom in just a hair here. We have our original raw here. We had the base exposure plus some adjustments to the highlights. Then we did some object removal in the sky, and we brought in some color corrections and some adjustments, bringing it from the original straight out of camera, underexposed for the highlights, raw, to the final blended result. Now that is an incredible transformation. Well, that wraps everything up for the post-processing portion of this lesson. Next time I see you guys, we'll be back in the field looking for some new interesting vantage points in Matera.